In this chapter, we are thinking very much about evaluating performance, but we're starting to think about evaluating performance of the organisation as a whole rather than focusing on a particular material cost or labour, which we were doing with the variance analysis. In order to appraise performance, we need to have a target. We need to have something to work towards. And in this chapter, we're going to be looking at the sorts of targets that companies might set and how these are related to performance measurement. So we're going to be having a look at mission statements and different types of objectives, as well as starting to think about ways of appraising performance. It's most likely that this chapter would be tested in section A of the exam because it links very much to the organisational objectives and goals that we covered at the start of the course. But it's here because it also links into the performance appraisal. The highest level targets then in an organisation will be those of the mission. So what top management believe their vision for the organisation is and what they are trying to achieve. That will be backed up then by objectives, and there are objectives at different levels of the organisation, and we'll be looking at strategic, tactical and operational objectives. We'll also be thinking about what the organisation has to get right in order to succeed, and those are known as critical success factors. And one of the ways that we can achieve this and measure our success in achieving it is through a technique known as benchmarking. So the mission then is the highest level of goal within the organisation, and it's the vision then by top management, what it is that they are trying to achieve. And a good mission statement should be brief, flexible, and also distinctive. What is it that makes the organisation unique? The mission statement that I have on the screen here then tells us a bit about what the organisation wants to do. So the company will provide great tasting food, and it talks as well about the environment, which makes it distinct. So it's going to be consistent, relaxed and safe. And it's also a very brief mission statement. It doesn't go on for pages and pages, so it's quite catchy. However, this is the mission statement for McDonald's, and sometimes we have to wonder if that is going to be consistent with the experience of McDonald's that we all have had. The other thing about this is it's a flexible mission statement because it doesn't just talk about hamburgers, and obviously McDonald's have diversified their food range a little bit. So the mission statement then is what top management believe. If as a customer of McDonald's that isn't what you believe, then obviously we can see that sometimes there will be a difference between top management's view and that of the customer. In section A then of the exam, how are mission statements going to be tested? Well, lecture example 1 is a good indication. We've got then 4 statements, and we want which one would not be expected to appear within the mission statement of a cafe. So the first one, A then, the cafe believes in paying a fair price to its suppliers and serves only fair trade tea and coffee. Well, that could appear in the mission statement because that is perhaps what's making them distinct, their relationship with their suppliers. Again, their homemade food, also perhaps making them distinct from other cafes. And who it exists for, well, it's there to provide a return for the investors, and it's there to provide refreshments for visitors to the park. So that's the reason then for it existing. The cafe then aiming to attract 200 customers per week would not appear in the mission statement because that isn't particularly flexible, especially if it grew, and also that is much more of an objective. So that is something that they might be trying to do within the grounds of a park cafe serving refreshments and homemade food and fair trade items. We said then that aiming to attract 200 customers this week was an example of an objective. Objectives then are quantified ways in which the company is going to try and achieve their mission. When we're setting objectives, we want to make sure that there is some goal congruence between the different objectives so that we've got consistency within different parts of the organisation. For example, there's no point in having a business like a fast food restaurant which is mostly governed with speed if one of your objectives or one of the targets that's set for the chefs is to do with perfection and to do with individual cooking to order. In order for an objective to be useful, it needs to be a SMART objective. So it needs to be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. So if we think about this objective up here, about the cafe attracting 200 customers this week, at the end of the week, you will be able to see whether or not that has been achieved. And you can see that it fits the characteristics. It's measurable because you'll be able to see whether or not 200 customers have been attracted. It's very specific because we're saying that we want to get customers into the cafe. It should be attainable. It's relevant for an organisation, for a cafe, and it's time bound because we will be able to see whether or not it's been achieved by the end of the week. In lecture example 2 then, let's imagine that your overall mission is to become a finance director of a FTSE 100 company. Now that's not going to happen overnight, so you'll need a series of objectives and goals to get there. And if we're thinking about a suitable objective regarding this course, remember that that objective needs to be a SMART objective. But getting ACCA qualified is going to help you on your route to becoming a finance director. And in order to get your ACCA qualification, you need to pass each paper, including this one. So we can make it specific by saying pass the F2 computer-based exam. And if we say within 6 weeks of the course ending. Now, instead of saying pass, you might have said get 50% or get 55%, whatever you're aiming for. But it's very specific. We're talking about F2. It's measurable. We can see whether or not you have passed your exam because you need to get at least 50% to have passed. It is going to be something which is attainable because you've studied for the paper. It's relevant to your target of passing your ACCA qualification so that you can then hopefully become a finance director. And it's time bound. In 6 weeks we'll know whether or not that has been achieved. That is a much better objective than saying work hard on management accounting paper, because it will be very difficult to know whether or not you have worked hard if there isn't a quantifiable output. Within an organisation then, there can be multiple objectives, and we've got what are known as primary corporate objectives, which are the main objectives, and then we can have our secondary objective. These are strategic ones which combined together should ensure that your overall or your primary goal can be achieved. Lots of companies then will have objectives related to growth in profits because that's going to be important for investors' continued support. However, the secondary objectives might be very different depending on the organisation. And in lecture example 3, we're coming up with some ideas then of objectives which could be secondary to growth in profits, i.e. things that are going to help them to achieve growth in profits. So it could be that we're going to be looking at sales growth to try and increase the profits. So perhaps trying to increase the market share of the organisation. So we'd be looking then at appealing to a greater sector of the population. And the way that companies could do that could be to do with continual technological innovation. So Apple then trying to grow their profits through technological innovation, which is going to lead to sales growth and therefore growth in profits. It could be to do with product quality, so making sure then that you've got a good reputation for quality or customer service, because that might justify higher prices being charged, which could justify higher profits. It might be to do with efficient use of resources, so making the product as cheap as possible while still satisfying customer needs. Another way of growing profits can be to reduce debt finance because of the costs associated with the interest and the debt repayments, because that would also grow profits. Or there might be a way of increasingly automating production, because although it will involve capital expenditure in the short term, it might reduce the labour costs and the running costs of the factory in the longer term. One thing though to say is that reducing costs might be at odds with growing sales, or might be at odds with product quality and customer service. So there can sometimes be conflict between objectives. And the way of growing your sales volumes might be to offer credit to customers, which would actually necessitate an increase in the level of debt finance needed, and also the level of bad debts, which could in turn actually reduce profits. As well as making distinction between primary and secondary objectives, we also need to make distinctions between the type of organisation. The focus here then is going to be mainly on looking at objectives from a control point of view, but we also need to think about the role that objectives play in planning in the organisation. Before a business then can set their budgets, they need to know what it is that they are trying to achieve and set the right kind of strategies to achieve those objectives. The main classification with types of firm is going to be to do with that of a profit-making firm whose primary objective is going to be concerned with returns to shareholders and shareholder satisfaction. So they could be looking at increasing profits, and they might do that through increased sales volume or sales revenue and or a reduction in costs. But we're looking very much here at the financial return that is going back to the shareholders. Contrast that then with an organisation that isn't aiming to make a profit. It can be much more difficult to identify what is their objective or their objectives. It could be to do with the satisfaction of users, so whether or not people feel happy with the service that is being provided to them. But even defining the users can be quite difficult. In a charity, for example, are the users the people who are donating goods and money, or are they the people that are consuming the services provided by the charity? Could also have objectives about how many people you're able to reach, so the level of service provision, and value for money, looking at the inputs in relation to the outputs, so how much it's costing to provide the service, perhaps on a per person or per hour basis, depending on the service. So with not-for-profit organisations then we could be thinking about government bodies, or we could be thinking about charities. Within an organisation as well, we're going to have objectives at different levels. So we're going to be having objectives at the top of the organisation, which are very much at the board level, thinking about long-term plans and where the organisation is aiming to go. selecting strategies that is going to help the board achieve its long-term objectives. Moving slightly down then, we're going to have tactical objectives. These are more medium term and will be translated eventually into the day-to-day, short-term operational objectives. So if we take a group like the Virgin Group, they're going to have strategic objectives using outside data, Richard Branson's creativity to think about where the organisation is going. And right down at the bottom of the organisation, we're going to have operational objectives, perhaps thinking about capacity on the train from London each day, thinking about the number of packets of crisps sold, and thinking about how we can contribute to the overall corporate objectives of profit growth and sales growth. Tactical objectives then will fit somewhere in the middle of that. So that might be looking at perhaps increasing passenger numbers overall. So thinking about whether extra routes are needed or extra trains. What we want to ensure then is that we have got consistency both horizontally and vertically. So we want to make sure that the focus on customer service and satisfaction is the same at all of the different levels. You might sometimes as well see a split based on how far into the future the targets are being set, and strategic goals or corporate planning thinking about very long term, whereas shorter term planning taking place at tactical and operational level. So how could all of this be translated into a question? Well, lecture example 4 gives us a very simple scenario. So Buster then selling vacuum cleaners, and we want to know which performance measures could be suitable for Buster at the strategic level. So we've got then 3 examples of performance measures, which I'm sure you'll agree are all suitable for an organisation, but we want to think about the strategic level, so this high level board objectives. So return on investment is going to be important because we're going to be looking at the return generated on the money invested. The board are going to be very concerned about making sure that their shareholders are satisfied. They'll also be concerned with market share. So if they're achieving growth in market share, then that's going to hopefully translate to higher profits through the higher sales being made. The number of vacuum cleaners returned would be important, but not at a strategic level. So lower down the organisation, perhaps at an operational or even a tactical level, we'd be concerned from a quality point of view. However, we're going to be looking at answer A here. As well as using our objectives then to plan to set our budgets, at the end of the period we can use them for control. So comparing our actual performance with our planned performance, and that's the sort of variance analysis that we've been talking about before. But we might also think about revising and reviewing our corporate plan. So businesses can't just set a plan and then carry on with it regardless of what's happening in the external environment. So they need to take into consideration external factors too. Objectives can help with making decisions as well, and so we can ensure that any decisions that the company make result in what we call goal congruent behaviour, so help contribute to the organisation's overall objectives. And this is going to take place at all levels within the organisation, which is why we need consistency between the objectives. We also need to think then about setting targets for critical success factors. And a critical success factor then is something that is absolutely fundamental to the organisation's success competitively. And what is a critical success factor for one organisation? will be different to another organisation. And we've just got some examples here then. So they could be to do with your usual sort of profitability and market share, but they could also be to do with productivity, to do with product leadership, so making sure your product is number one in the market. That's especially important for firms that specialise in high-tech products. To do with the development of your people as key assets, so that would be very important for an organisation where the people were the key strength. So for example, for a football club, developing talent and having key scorers or even strikers would be very useful. Employee attitudes, if you're very dependent on the service that your customers are going to be receiving, perhaps in a restaurant or a hotel, then that would be very important. And public responsibility could be important for success, especially in an organisation such as BP or Shell, where there's a high degree of environmental responsibility associated with the extraction of the oil. So once we know what our critical success factors are, we can help use them to identify key objectives and goals for the organisation, and then that can feed down into performance measures. So if customer satisfaction is going to be important, we could link bonuses and rewards to feedback from customers in the service industry. As well as existing conflict between the objectives, so for example, increasing sales may actually reduce profits if bad debts rise, there can also be conflict between different time frames when we're setting objectives. Managers then are very often appraised on the short-term results, so profits for the period, profits for the year. The problem with that is it can lead to a sacrifice on the longer-term objectives. Consider this example then. If a manager is going to be paid a bonus based on maximising profits in the next 6 months, one of the ways then to do that is to reduce costs. So that could involve delaying research and development, advertising, or any other investment which actually is going to be very important for the long-term future of the company. So how do companies try and encourage managers to take a longer term view? Well, make targets more realistic. So don't have profit targets which are going to involve cutting everything back to the bone. Making sure then that there's enough management information to see perhaps the benefits of longer term objectives. And think about evaluating their performance based on more than one measure. So if we want to try and encourage share growth, investor returns, then we could link managers' performance to share price, a longer term measure than short term profits. We might also have targets which are not financial, so have targets that are based on quality. Another technique that we can use is benchmarking. With benchmarking, we're going to adopt best practice as the target. So the business will attempt to improve its own performance through basically copying what's already been achieved elsewhere. The benefit of this approach is that you know it's possible if it's been achieved elsewhere. Performance should be improved, and it can be made as good as the competition or better in the most important areas of operation. So they're challenging targets. They're not necessarily going to be easy, but they should improve the operations of the business. The other thing about benchmarking is that you don't have to make all of your own mistakes. You can learn from someone else. So sometimes you might hear the phrase, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's already been done. We can just utilise other people's experience. It's especially useful in not-for-profit organisations because they're not aiming to make money. There's less issues with confidentiality and sharing best practice. So you might see benchmarking taking place between local libraries or between different local authorities sharing information on how they provide services. There are 4 different types then of benchmarking that you need to be aware of. So internal benchmarking then is when we're comparing one unit or function within the same organisation. So that could be branches of the same bank, it could be local libraries within the same town. Competitive benchmarking then is when we're gathering information about someone or another organisation that we're in direct competition with. That information then often going to be quite tricky to come by. It's unlikely that Mr. Volkswagen is going to throw open the doors to Mr. Ford so that they can go and have a look around the factory and steal ideas. So one of the ways that that might be achieved is through reverse engineering, which is where you take the competitor's product and have engineers take it apart to see if they can learn any clues about how it was manufactured from the end product. Functional benchmarking is similar, but it's when internal functions are compared regardless of industry. So we might have businesses which are not in competition, so therefore happy to share information, but have similar processes. So they might be happy to share information on debt collection. A credit card company might be able to share information with a company that is selling widgets because the debt collection process is the same, but they're not in direct competition with one another. Another example of functional benchmarking is if it's the same type of production process. So HP were able to benchmark Coca-Cola to see best practice about putting the lids onto bottles. And Coca-Cola were happy to share that information because there wasn't a direct conflict. People don't drink brown sauce as a substitute for Coke. Finally, we've got strategic benchmarking, which is when we're looking at radical changes within the organisation. So we're looking then at overriding principles being changed within the organisation. And again, we're looking at processes here. It doesn't necessarily need to be directly in competition with one another. So Formula One was used then by British Airways when they were looking at seeing how they could turn their planes around faster. Strategic change within BA about how to turn the planes around faster, based on the idea then of the Formula One racing cars going into the pits, getting all hands to the pump at the same time to get those cars back out and to get those planes back out into the sky. And that increased then the profits of BA because they were spending more time flying and less time on the ground with their expensive planes. ReadZone then is an online bookstore that wants to undertake external benchmarking to evaluate the delivery process. So they're concerned then about the delivery process, and we want to know which would be the most suitable organisation to approach to share data with. So we've got 4 different options here then, and we need to think about which one is going to be best. So we've got then 2 organisations that are also selling books. The market leader in online book retailing. Now, ReadZone might want to share their information about their delivery process, but it's unlikely that they would be prepared to share. They're not going to give a potential competitor access to their information. So while we might want to, we're unlikely to, so they're not going to be suitable. The high street bookseller, well, distribution is very different. If you go to a high street bookshop, then you buy the book and you take it away. So of the 4 that we've got then, we've got 2 that are also selling books. The market leader then in online book retailing might sound like a good choice. However, although we might want to share information, i.e. copy from them, they're going to be very unlikely to share information. They're not going to want a potential competitor having access to their processes and learning from the countless mistakes that they would have made along the way. So it's not going to be suitable because they're not going to want to share. With the high street bookseller as well, that one is going to be unsuitable because when you go into a bookshop, you're the distribution process, you're the delivery process. You take the book away with you in a bag and deliver it to your home. Then we've got pizzas and ties to choose between. Well, pizza's very different. They have to be hot and fast the delivery because they're perishable. Nobody wants a cold pizza that was cooked 2 days ago. So an online tie retailer is probably going to be the one that you might be able to share information with, because books and ties are not really in competition with one another, but similar in terms of size and perishability, and also in terms of distribution channels, so online distribution. Just a short summary here for this chapter then. So the mission then is the top objective, the vision of top management, sometimes known as the raison d'etre, the reason for being. Objectives then help to achieve that mission, and those should be SMART: specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. We talked about different types of objectives then, so primary and then the secondary objectives which help to achieve that overall goal, and also at different levels within the organisation. Finally then, in terms then of objectives, we were talking about setting and identifying those goals which are fundamental to success, and those are known as critical success factors. One of the tools then for setting objectives can be benchmarking, where you're going to identify the best in class and aim to be as good, if not better than that. And there are 4 types of benchmarking: internal, within the same organisation; competitive, the same product; functional, the same process; and strategic, thinking about overarching change within the organisation.